All right. We're on Tuesday, November 1st. We are talking about our introductory to safety for the lathe. So, yesterday we talked a little bit about ideas for our honey dippers. And hopefully, you're at least got your 6 brainstormings done. Hopefully, you've gotten a chance to check out that YouTube video. It's just a really short 15-minute video on a guy just actually making a honey dipper start from finish. However, there are a few things that guy does that don't necessarily want you to develop those habits. So, kind of keep in mind that we are here to try and teach you all best practices. And if you decide in the future that you want to use lathe tools and lathe parts and do turning on the lathe, and you want to do your own kind of sketchy techniques, that's on you. Okay. A couple things to review before we get started. Honey dippers, there's a lot of processes involved. So we are going to talk a little bit about how to get started and rolling through this entire process. So when we get back on Friday, you should have an understanding of about where to get started when we're on the lathe. So if you're keeping track of what's happening, we're on the design process. We're about to transition into actually making this honey dipper. So what I have here that's actually over by the lathes is kind of this really cool board that's got this step-by-step process to get to your honey dipper. So we're going to start with an actual rectangular blank. You can see it's about a 1-inch square piece of lumber that's about 7 inches long that we are getting our blank from. And then we're slowly going to transition into getting this rounded down, starting to actually cut down our handle to size. And notice that we're leaving tick marks along the way to try and get all of our rounds for our beads as well as our grooves later on. Working on our handle and our thicknesses of the actual honey dipper portion. We start to round things off. And then this is what you should notice about your paper that you will cut out once we get back, is that it should start to fit your actual wood piece on the lathe. So you're going to use your piece of paper as a template. So you need to hang on to that. Make sure it's in your binders. And then as you move down, you can just continue to get cuts figured out until you end up getting to, my camera's not quite long enough to reach, until we actually get to the honey dipper at the very end. My apologies for not being able to figure out my camera settings. So should have last couple steps. This is going to be sanded to 220 grit sandpaper. So we will be handing that out to you on Friday when we get back as well. Now, if we're looking at our study guide, first thing that we're going to look at is different types of tools that you're going to use. If you're following along on your sheets, should notice very clearly that we have lots of names of different parts on the lathe. You will need to know all of those. And we will also start to learn some different different names about tools. So I'm going to run through all these tools with you here in my office, and then we're going to jump over to the wood shop and actually jump on a lathe and start talking about the rest of the safety stuff. So as you're following along, make sure that you have your safety guides with you. Okay, so first item that it talks about is a skew. A lot of different wood turners use a variety of different tools. This is called a skew. This is actually just kind of an older version of a wood turning tool that you don't really see too often. This is one of my least favorite tools for cutting. There are some really nice elements about this one in particular. You can see a very nice sharp point. So as we'll be able to see later on, my wood stock is going to be perpendicular like this. And I just simply am going to lay this skew on the tool rest and just very gently poke in, and this will actually slice all of those little wood fibers on our round stock. So this will cut it down. So this is called a skew. The other Tool that is a little bit different that you won't use as much. This is called a parting tool. This is just got this nice triangular shape. It's a lot wider than the skew. Basically, this is how you're going to get your grooves that are inside of your honey dipper. So like the actual spot where you dip inside the honey jar, this is what you're going to cut those out with. This is called a parting tool. There's a lot of different variations of sizes. You can actually see this is relatively thick in terms of that distance in between each of your ribs on your grooves. So if we're looking back into our samples, you can see that this would be the tool that you would use to part, but this tool in particular is very, very wide. This is what we're going to end up using to get these honey dippers off of the lathe. So you'll notice that we go from this step to this step. We cut this off using this parting tool. The rest of the tools that we're going to use or talk about are called gouges. Now, gouges have kind of this rounded shape that you can see up here. So this is the part that's going to hang out on the tool rest. So when we get to the lathe, you're going to see a tool rest that looks like this. I'm going to set my roughing gouge on top of that, and that's how I'm going to make my cut. You're going to see here that there's a really, really dramatic taper. This is called a bevel. We're going to end up running through the ABCs of wood turning, which means that we are going to anchor, bevel, and cut every time we're using any of these tools on a wood lathe. So this bevel is the second portion. We're going to make sure that we're anchored to our tool rest first. We're going to actually bring this beveled edge up to our wood stock that we're going to cut, and then we're going to rotate over to smooth it out. Okay, so it's anchor, bevel, cut process. This is actually one of the larger gouges that we have. One of the larger ones means that it's a roughing gouge. So you're trying to go from your first step. You're trying to get from like having a very square chunk of wood, and we're trying to round it down into a cylinder. So that's where this guy comes into play. So all sorts of different styles of gouges here in a sec. If you're looking at your sheets, you'll notice that we went from skew to parting tool, which is at the very bottom. And then now we're talking about the large roughing gouge. And then we have a variation of different spindle gouges. The ones that we don't really have too many are deep fluted bowl gouges and square scrapers. We do have a few around the shop. However, those aren't nearly as common. What you will see at each of your station is you will have a skew, you will have a roughing gouge, and you'll have tons of other spindle gouges, and you may see some small bowl gouges as well. And then lastly, it's just that parting tool. Parting tool comes in different variations as well, so we'll be showing you that once we get into the shop. So, roughing gouge on that one. Your primary tools are going to be your spindle gouges. Now, your most common spindle gouge looks something about like this. If you remember, your roughing gouge is a lot bigger and it's a lot flatter. This is starting to get a little bit more of a curve to it. So this flat portion on this roughing spindle gouge allows us to be able to take out bigger chunks so that we can get that nice and smooth. Then you'll notice that your spindles end up changing shape to get a little bit more rounded. That means that we have the ability to get a little bit of a finer point, which means you can get some really cool details. Okay, so this is what I'm going to end up using, putting on the tool rest to anchor. Notice how your bevel also is pretty steep on this one. So we're going to anchor, we're going to lift up to the bevel, and then we're going to rotate and start making cuts. So this is spindle gouge. And then there are all sorts of different variations of these gouges in either buckets or in the organizers next to each of the lathes. So we've got an even tighter spindle gouge there. Let me get my paper out of the way so you can see. So we've got different types of spindle gouges. This one's even finer. And then I even have this one that's itty bitty 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 bitty. So you can see how we end up changing sizes, and we're going to go from the biggest one to start all the way down to the smallest one to get a really fine detail. Okay. So those are the tools that we'll end up using inside of the shop. It's just kind of nice to have a little bit better visual of all of those different tools. So why don't we take a break and we'll head over to the wood shop. So go ahead and keep it running because I can ramble and I can edit anything out. So FYI, it's 20 minutes normally. All right, so we're back into the wood shop. We have gone over all of the tools on the lathe that you will be using. And then we're now going to talk about each of the pieces real quick. So if you're looking at the diagram on the upper left-hand corner, if we're going to try and look at this as terms of like an animal or a person, this is the head of the machine, and then this is the tail of the machine. So we're going to look at our headstock. We've got a chuck here, kind of similar to the drill press. We also have our tool rest, and we also have our tailstock. Some other things that you'll know too, this thing right here is called a banjo. The banjo is what actually holds the tailstock in place, so you can get your tools as close to your workpiece as possible. Some other things that you'll also notice is that there should be two different buttons on the front. This right here is in terms of gears and belts. Don't need to bother with that because we have an electronic control. So, red button here is our on and off switch. This dial right here, kind of like the scroll saw, tells us how fast we're moving. So right now I've got this dial set to 0. So when I pull this forward to turn on, shouldn't move at all. As soon as I start to spin that dial, that chuck should start to move. So some things that we need to talk about before we start turning our honey dippers. We need to talk about our wood piece next. We need to take this square or rectangular piece of wood and we need to actually get it set in place in order to set up so that we can actually start to turn this. So if you're noticing, underneath all the tool parts, there's a little diagram that shows you a crosshair on the end of your wood stock. In order for us to center this onto our spindle, our wood piece needs to have an X. So you run over to the bandsaw and you're going to carve out a little X to show you where your center point is. Okay? So I'm doing that on both ends as well. Okay. Once you have your live centers figured out, we're then going to go ahead and get this put into the spindle. Another thing that you will notice on items as far as your tool is something called a knockout rod. It's a little handle that's got a rod on the inside that we use for knocking out the spindle. The spindle is actually really tight inside of here, but it's only slip tight. So if you notice, you'll take your knockout rod, there's a little hole in the hand wheel over here, and I'm just simply going to slide that out and make sure that I keep hold of this spindle. This is very important. A lot of teenagers don't know what to do when they're trying to use the knockout rod, and you notice that I keep my hand in front of the spindle when I'm trying to knock it out, because you'll anticipate that this goes onto the floor. This will get bent by the concrete if it lands on the floor. So it's very imperative that when you're getting ready to put your workpiece inside of the lathe, make sure you put a hand over the top of it just to catch it. Don't let this hit the floor. Next thing is we need to get this spindle onto our stock. Now, the guy in the video that I posted for Monday, he actually went ahead and just hammered this right onto the bed right here. Not in my shop, not in our school shop. Reason being is that's going to dent this bed. He ends up taking a hammer, which is over here, ends up taking a mallet and taps it in right on top of the bed. It's going to dent this. All you need to do, bring it to the floor, make sure you're lining up the ribs as close as possible, giving that just a couple quick taps, make sure it's in place, and you're ready to mount this to your lathe. So go ahead and slide this back in. Now if you hammered it in well enough, it should hold. It might not. Doesn't look like mine is holding. So this is where we're going to get our tailstock involved. Tailstock, there's a couple different things that we will need to work on. There's handle for the actual tailstock lock. That will make sure that this entire thing doesn't move. Okay? So once I lock that in place, that will not move. On top of that, we also have an adjustment for the actual end to pinch our piece of wood in place. So it's a two-step process. So I'm going to watch real close. Make sure that this is nice and loose. Go ahead and mount our wood stock back into our spindle. Bring our tailstock right up to the X that you made on the bandsaw. Pardon the interruption. And get this so it's a little bit tight. Now, you'll notice that there's another tailstock hand wheel. This is actually what controls this live center back here. So you'll notice that I can move this back and forth. I can loosen this a lot, or I can tighten this. So what you want to do is just make sure that that's nice and tight. Go ahead and just take the handle and just slowly tighten it. We don't want to hammer it too hard. Just want to make sure that it's holding. You'll also notice, see me put my hands on top of this to make sure it's not shaking. And it is shaking just a little bit, so I'm going to give it a little bit more pressure. And that seems pretty good. So now I can lock this, which will then lock my handle. So now I have two locks here. I've got a lock for the entire tailstock. I also have a lock for the handle for the live center. Okay, so that's all set up. So this is good to go. Now, the next thing we need to do is get our tool rest in place. We want to have our tool rest within 1/4 of an inch of our livestock at all times. 1/4 of an inch is actually pretty large. It's the size of your pinky nail, by the way. What I would recommend doing is actually getting it as close as humanly possible without actually touching, okay? So what you're going to do is just loosen up this banjo, make sure that that's in place as close as possible. Go ahead and just do a really soft lock there, and then we can put our our tool rest in place. Our tool rest, we want to try and have it right about where the spindle is and just going as far as the piece of wood. Now, your honey dippers are going to be a lot smaller. This is a large piece of stock. So it's a lot bigger than our tool rest, so we're going to have to move our tool rest back and forth numerous times. So I'm going to get this pretty high up. I'm going to be just below center. Since it's just below center, we're going to lock that in place, and then I'm going to go ahead and just start rotating. Now, you can see I didn't get very close to my tailstock at all. Excuse me, to my wood stock at all. So I'm going to go ahead and just take my banjo and slide it way close. Now that I've got it that close, we want to check to make sure that it's not going to hit once I start to turn this. First thing I notice, it does hit. That's just going to make a bunch of noise, and it's going to make Mr. Paschal and Miss Doolittle real grumpy. So, I'm just going to take my banjo, slide it back just a bit, lock that in place, and you're noticing that I am constantly turning this with my hand as I'm setting it up. You want to make sure that you're not putting yourself into a bad situation. And to do so, you're constantly checking to make sure that you are not going to smash into the tool rest. Okay, pretty well set up. So now we're going to kind of continue to roll through our safety tests, or excuse me, our study guides. Make sure that we understand all of the potential dangers as far as the lathe. Most common types of injuries. As you notice, when this wood stock, or excuse me, wood stock turns, we are creating a pinch point with the tool rest. Notice how I can easily get my finger sucked in here if I'm not paying attention, okay? So if my finger gets sucked into that spot, that's going to be a really bad time. That pinch point is also cause for all sorts of having a spinning chuck attached right here. So not only are there lots of things that can get bound up, your tools can get bound up and you can get bound up pretty easily. So this is one of those machines where it's really important to be thinking about tie up, tuck in, and take off. Okay? Certain things such as long sleeves, such as jewelry, as hair, all needs to be either taken off or tied up. Watches, even our little wristbands, our long sleeves. We need to take care of all those. In terms of tools, you will also notice that we can create a pinch point by having this tool go all the way inside. When I'm using the roughing gouge, that's not quite as common because it's such a massive tool. However, if I've got something small like this tiny spindle gouge, that can easily get trapped on the inside. And if you notice the trajectory, tools could smack you in the face. Okay? So we want to make sure that that tool rest is as tight as possible to our wood. And we're going to adjust this constantly. You're going to be turning the lathe on and off constantly. You're going to be moving this back and forth with your hand when it's off all the time. And we're just going to make sure that we're staying as safe as possible. Okay, other things. If you remember from the NRWG presentations, you saw a lot of chips flying out. Now, those volunteers have built some pretty bad reputations. A lot of them did not wear face shields. You will be wearing face shield. And notice I also have my safety glasses on. When I am actually turning wood, the face shield is there to protect my face from getting splinters, protect my neck from getting splinters. God forbid you do ever get something trapped inside of here, this is just enough to protect your neck, okay? However, if we do get something really sharp like this tool coming at us, our eyes are still extremely vulnerable. So you will use bulb, okay? So.
It went from counting up to counting down.
Go ahead and turn it off.
It's rolling.
Okay, so those are the dangers as far as what we're going to look at with the lathe. Now, we're getting pretty ready to start doing some rough cutting on our wood stock. You'll notice I have a very rectangular piece. You're going to end up getting stocks that are a lot more square, so it won't be quite as dramatic when we're cutting down to size. I'm going to end up using the roughing gouge, which is the bigger one that we talked about earlier. And we're going to make sure that we're cutting this down so that it's cylindrical, okay? So a couple things before we get started. I'm going to put my face shield down in a second. I'm going to start really low on low speeds to make sure that I have no problems with this hitting my tool stock. I'm going to double check my spacing, make sure I'm within 1/4 of an inch. And then we're going to talk about our first of the acronym ABC. Every time we're talking about lathes, we're going to talk about ABCs. Okay, so checking to make sure that our wood is good to go. One massive problem, make sure that you take your knockout rod out. We'll take care of that. Now, with your ABCs, the ABCs of wood turning is called for anchor, bevel, cut. You guys should be glad we're taking some time off so that I can recuperate, because I can't talk. All right, anchor, bevel, cut. Anchor is very simply, what's your stature? There's a few different ways that you can actually hold this tool. And I'm going to teach you the way that I was taught by Dean, who volunteers with NRWG, who is here every Tuesday with Woodworking Club. And his anchor is that you end up doing what's called a dance. You end up anchoring to your hip into the tool rest, okay? So you're gonna make sure that you're kind of in that like athlete's pose with your feet about shoulder to hip width apart. Make sure that your knees are bent a little bit so you don't pass out. And you're gonna anchor to the tool rest. Now, several different things to note here. I'm left-handed. This is gonna look backwards for a lot of you. Most of you are gonna put this tool rest in your right, or this tool in your right hand, anchor it to your right hip, and your left hand is going to be holding to make sure that it is moving back and forth properly. Okay, so the way that I was taught as far as cutting is that you want to do a little bit of dancing. Okay, and the dance is just moving your hips back and forth so that you end up moving with the tool. It's not necessarily that we're going to try and do some sort of TikTok video right now, although we could. But we're going to try and just dance our way through moving back and forth. The reason you do that is you want to maintain the same height. If I just end up doing this, you're going to notice that I'm going to cut a lot deeper at different spots, okay? So that's why you want to have kind of that flex back and forth. A couple other hand positions that you can do. I prefer to have my hand over the top and anchor with my hand to my hip and then lift the tool up. Some of you may want to do a hand over the top with your thumb in the center, which is fine as well, okay? Whichever position works for you. So, as long as we got the A, that's our anchor. The next step is our bevel. The bevel is where we begin to cut, okay? So, or right before we start cutting. This bevel is what I was talking about in my office earlier. This is specifically designed such that I bring my tool up to a specific bevel before it starts cutting, okay? So anchor, bevel. Let me show you kind of an example of why we do this in this fashion. If I'm anchored properly, I've got my tool rest up, there's no potential for us to pinch. I could literally let this sit and dance like this for the entire, eternity, and I would not get a pinch because we're not beveling yet. As soon as we're anchored, we will always end up having a spot where we can hit the wood and we do not create a pinch point. As soon as you begin to bevel, that is where we're getting a little bit closer to start cutting, okay? Now on this particular one, since it's pretty large up, I'm going to go way back, and then once I've anchored, I begin to bevel. And you'll see I start to cut. And you start to see some tips. So you can start to see that I'm getting a few chunks out of here. So I'm going to put this in my left hand so I'm a little bit more comfortable, and I'm going to crank up the speed because I'm a little bit more comfortable on this. And we're going to really let that fly. I'm going to move this just a hair off to the side. Since I made an adjustment on my banjo, just want to make sure I'm clear and not going to knock anywhere around. And we're all set. Anchor, and raise up until I start cutting. Alright, so now I'm starting to get a little bit more of a rounded edge on this side, and I'm starting to get pretty far away from my tool rest. So I'm going to start cutting on this side. You won't be doing this because you're going to have a bit smaller piece, which should fit this entire tool rest. But since I have a bigger piece, I need to readjust, make sure I get my banjo in the right spot, lock it in place, and I'm going to try and scoot that in just a hair. Okay, and then I can resume cutting. kind of continue doing that until you start to get a really round piece. Oh, that's stuck in it. Alright, so as you can see, I pretty well got this rounded out, and this is about the time where we're going to start to talk about our templates. So don't mind a couple of my missing teeth, also don't mind the fact that I have a piece that's already too small. We're going to kind of just run with this. So what you'll need next is you'll need your template, so you'll need that part. You'll also need the cutout section and a pencil, as well as one of these compasses. So we're going to go through and measure out where our pieces need to be, and this is going to help us with our widths as well. Okay, so this compass will allow us to check different thicknesses. So if I am checking to see how thick my wood stock is, I'm going to just check that real quick, a little bit tighter, somewhere right in there. And then we'll compare that to thicknesses of our actual template. Now I'm a little bit small, so I'm not going to cut down any more on this one. In the future though, you're going to be getting a block of wood that's actually the right size, not just some diagonal cut that I found in an emergency. So we're going to go through with the pencil and just kind of mark out different spots that we need to start thinking about trimming down just a tad. So first shape I'm going to look at is I'm going to look at the overall length. Then I'm going to go through and use my compass and just mark off thicknesses as well. Okay, so pretty simple. All you need to do in this situation is line up your piece of paper to about where you want it. And I'm going to go ahead and just kind of keep the tool stock in place. You can just go ahead and put this on like a pretty low speed and just go ahead and start marking off where you would like to have this. So if I'm thinking that I want to have the head of this about there, just go ahead and put a pencil mark, make sure that stays straight, and we're going to get all the way to the opposite side. This is looking super good since I'm trying to show the camera. Somewhere in there. And then I also have a vital spot for that bead there. Ooh, a little wonky. You can actually use your pencil on the tool rest as well, which is kind of helpful. But we're going to mark off that spot there. Come over and mark off this bead. And mark off this bead. And then I'm also going to go through and start marking off all of the teeth that I have. Don't mind the one that's missing. Just going to go ahead and lay that right here. So I'm going to notice there's going to be one groove there. Got another groove there. Got another groove there. And just go through and mark it until you get all the way through. Perfect. Now I like to try and remember which ones are which, so I'm just going to go through and also just leave a tiny amount of like colored in material so I know which grooves I need to cut. Just like that. Now I've realized I made a grave error because as soon as I start cutting into this, I'm going to lose all of my grooves. So we're going to just start by roughing out the shape of this first, okay? So I'm going to just try and put some accents at each of these different spots. And it looks like I need to do a little bit better job of getting those cleaned up. So I'm going to just mark a couple of those off again. One moment. That edge looks good. This edge should be more like there. His teeth look like they're in good spots though. Okay, so just kind of made a couple adjustments. You do notice that I did end up switching to a different bowl gouge. And this is kind of where we're going to start making kind of indentations, right? So we're going to start from the top and start working our way down. The way that I like to do this is just kind of to anchor in and just start my way in and just kind of start working back and forth until you're feeling comfortable. Notice how nice and snug my tool rest can get now because of how close we're. And notice that as I'm cutting too, I'm going to take the tool bit and I'm just going to start angling it down. That's going to help me get kind of that bead shape and really get nice and flat up against that edge, okay? So don't forget that you're still going to do your ABCs, you're going to anchor, you're going to begin to bevel, and just as soon as you start cutting, you're going to go ahead and start to rotate down. And I take my tool all the way until it's nice and flat. I'm just going to rotate back and forth. Until I start to just get a nice edge. Okay, that's looking pretty good, and you can see how nice and shiny that's looking too. These smaller tools and that higher speed really allows that to get a nice smooth edge to it. So a couple things to note too. Notice how I'm always starting from the top and working my way inward. A lot of times what will happen is students do the opposite, where they'll want to start from the top and work their way up. That's always going to have a kickback, because you'll notice I can actually like dig my tool bit into that piece, and I even just took a little shred out. So if I start and go downhill into that center, start from the top and then work my way downhill, you'll never have a kickback, okay? I'm actually going to try the skew on this one. That seems like it would be a nice spot to try on something like this. What's really nice about this guy is it's got this really, really sharp point. And so what I can do I simply just kind of take my tool and just rotate it down into that gap. Crank up the speed just a little bit. Even with the skew, you're going to make sure that you do your anchor bevel cut. Just kind of continue working my way down. Okay, gonna do the same thing moving forward. I'm gonna dodge all those teeth, just double check every once in a while with my plans, make sure I'm in the right spot. So I'm looking pretty good there. I'm gonna go ahead and start cutting out on this edge right here. Back to my other tool real quick. Let's go ahead and use this guy a little bit bigger. We're getting really fine dust, which is nice, but we still got a lot of cutting to do. So I'm going to go ahead and start here and just very carefully kind of just anchor and bevel and cut into this surface. Yeah, it's a little nicer. So notice how when I was going from here, I do want to start working on this side, so I'm going to pick my tool up and actually start from this other end. So anchor, beveling, and then cutting. Yep, uphill climb, came down just a little bit. Always got to be prepared for little things like that. Okay, looking good. I'm going to come back through every once in a while and just kind of start to shape some things. I can definitely make sure that this is a little bit more rounded. So if you know back to my plans, we're making this nice and round. Perfect. Okay, I think that looks pretty good. So double check that. Perfect. Okay, so now I've also got a little bubble over here. And then this is going to end up flattening out here in a little bit too. So I just wanted to take a quick break to reposition the camera. I'm going to start continuing to just drop this down just a hair. I'm going to work on this handle portion just a little bit more, and then we've got to cut off on our last bead over on this side. So we're going to start on this end, kind of work my way down until it's nice and smooth. Okay, that one's starting to come down, and then I'm going to start to work on this guy just a hair as well. Okay, got a little start there. Go ahead and start working on getting this drop down just a hair. And then that's going to line out with the rest of this as well. A little much there. Okay, I'm going to take a quick check-in and just see how things are coming. By the way, if you're hearing a buzzing on that machine, it's just trying to cool itself down a little bit. So go ahead as I set my tool down and just kind of checking to see how things are going. So we can still drop down quite a bit on both of our beads. You're kind of noticing that I'm starting to get a little bit of a triangular shape. That's because of the way that this bit fits. It doesn't really round things very well. So that's where our skew is going to come into play, because we can just round those tips. We can actually get a really nice tight edge into our handle as well. But in our hierarchy of things, let's go ahead and just kind of start to round these top parts, and then we'll drop this down just a little bit as well. So I'm going to switch tools real quick. Got my skew ready, and I'm also noticing that my tool rest is sitting pretty high, so I'm going to just drop this down just a hair, and I am still right up against that. You just want to, every time you move your tool rest, just check and make sure you're not rubbing too much. We are starting to get a little bit of a gap here because we're narrowing down our handle. That's to be expected, but just kind of make sure that you understand that this could become pretty nasty pinch point. Okay, so on the skew, you're actually ending up cutting, which you kind of can end up doing some like rounded things with it. So depends on how you want to actually position this. This is really good just flat to try and get that nice and round. Just make sure that you're not stabbing into your wood on this one end. So the way to prevent that, instead of holding your tool sideways flat like this, you kind of start to just roll. And as you can see, as you roll, you make your way to a really nice fine point right there. Okay, so that's how we're going to get kind of a rounded little feature. And then I can flip this back over and just kind of scar right inside of there too. Let's see, trying to figure out how to do this, Mr. P. Okay, I feel like I remember saying that we could go through and start really chunking out some of our pieces on our beads. So you did just kind of notice me skip a little bit and jam myself into this handle. And so that's really common for where I would have gotten a kickback because I'm starting to climb uphill, right? If you're noticing that my tool tip ends up going like this and then all of a sudden jams into that top part, my tool gets stuck and I just tear out my handle. Now, moving a little bit slower than I want to, so I'm going to switch back to one of my spindle gouges and just really start to go to town on getting these dropped back down. And then I'll clean up the tops of those beads with my spindle a little bit later. Okay, so I'm getting pretty close there. Let's take a quick sec, and I'm going to measure out my handle. So we're going to need our compass, and we're going to end up not getting this the right way. I'm just going to very carefully measure the outside part of my handle so that we can see how close we need to get. And I tighten that, make sure that I'm a little bit off. Must have squeezed it just a hair. And right about there looks good. Okay, so got my compass all set, so we're gonna try and get this a little bit smaller. We got a little ways to go on this guy, so let's go ahead and just start rounding that part out. All right, had to do a quick break. Switch batteries out, and then I'm going to continue roughing this, getting this down to about the right size that I have here. Just going to double check that measurement one last time, make sure I got it set correctly. Yep, perfect. Whoops. Okay, we're good to go. Ooh, that's looking pretty close. One more pass. And this time I'm going really slow because I want to try and get a nice little finish on there.
So that part right there is perfect. Just a hair more everywhere else. So I said this part here is perfect. Okay, excellent. So we're not going to touch this part anymore. Next part we're going to measure is just our beads to make sure that those are correct. So I'm going to double check and make sure that I've got everything all set here. Something about like that. Probably just help if I use the table, pardon me, off camera. Okay, so beads need to be about that big on the peak. So I got a little ways to go on both of those. So I'm just going to kind of work my way down at this point. And then on this guy, this one's got kind of a sharp point, so I'm going to get the skew out in just a second. This one all around just needs cut down, so I'm going to start there. Okay, time to switch to the skew to get those nice and round. One thing I am kind of noticing that when I'm pushing, I'm starting to flex just a hair. So I'm going to see if I can't just either relieve or strengthen this just a tad to make sure that we are tight and good to go. Now I'm noticing also a couple little things like this is looking a little rough. This needs to get trimmed down a little bit. And we'll go ahead and just work on detailing and getting this purdy. dragging somewhere. Okay, I'm gonna just kind of clean these up a little bit, so. And then as I do that, I stab right in. All right, so that's getting pretty close. We're gonna save some of this for sanding. And I'm going to clean up a little bit of this more. Making sure that I test with my compass to make sure that everything's good. I'm going a little bit too fast there. Now I'm getting a peek again. Okay, so we're getting pretty close. Next thing that we need to do is just check to make sure that our grooves are going to be in the right spot. So this is where I'm going to get my pencil out for realsies. I marked it twice already. Get my pencil out and just mark out each of the teeth on my grooves. Ballparking on my missing tooth. And this is where you're going to transition into your parting tool that I showed you earlier. Ended up getting one of these out of the cabinet. That's over by the wall over here. This is pretty simple. All you need to do is just lift up the edge, you anchor, and your bevel is just tapping this part, and just very, very slowly begin to chunk out your grooves. And you're just going to kind of go very slowly, make sure you're nice and centered. And this will do a good job of doing really small grooves. Now, a couple things that you may have noticed every time I'm starting to go in with my parting tool, I'm starting to end up bowing my honey dipper out. We want to prevent that from snapping. And so one thing that the guy does in the video that's actually okay is you want to just make sure that you're holding it back here. Don't grip it, don't hang on to it. But you're just going to carefully keep your hands here, make sure you're not in any sort of pinching position, but just make sure you're putting light pressure on it so that you don't snap your honey dipper prematurely. Very slowly find my center inside of this parting tool. we're just going to go through and do each of those. All right, so we're getting pretty close to getting ready to cut this off. Before we do that though, we need to do some sanding. What we haven't talked about yet in class is you will actually be getting 3 different types of sandpaper. You'll notice 3 different colors. Each of these ends up being, did I not hit record?
No, you did. It just wasn't focused.
Oh,
So you
gotcha.
couldn't tell that they were different. So I was trying to help you out there.
Perfect. So this really dark red, or not dark red, dark brown is going to be 80 grit sandpaper. This lighter colored stuff here is going to be 150. And then this is 220. Those mean that this is going to be some different grain structure. So if you remember from class, all of our machines use a 50 grit sandpaper. This one over here is 80, so it's getting finer, which means that the more that you sand with it should get smoother. So this gets even finer at 150, and this even gets finer than that at 220. For you to turn this in, it does need to be sanded at 220. Before we start sanding, we need to get this banjo out of the way. What you're going to end up doing is just rubbing sandpaper over the top of this guy pretty much everywhere. So in order to get to the spots that we need to, this tool rest is going to cause problems for us. So we need to get it out of the way. Pretty simply, just going to take that banjo and that tool rest, move it off to the side. We're done with it for a little while. I'm going to go ahead and crank on the speed until I get a little bit more comfortable. And because you're kind of starting to notice that this piece is flexing a little bit when I press it, make sure that you're keeping a nice grip on both sides so you don't snap it. So you simply just take your sandpaper, which you're going to get some here soon, and just go through and give it some nice touch-ups. Now I've got some massive grooves on a couple of these spots, so that's where I'm going to start with this 80 grit and try and just take care of some of those pieces. Try and get it so that it's nice and smooth. Now, this isn't really doing too much, so I'm going to go ahead and crank up the speed a little bit more. And just continue to sand it until I start to feel those bumps disappear. Sometimes people on the lathes, turners, some good turners, don't even need to use sandpaper. They get so good with their tools. We're novices, myself included, so we're going to go ahead and take the time and just sand all of our pieces down. Okay, it's looking pretty good. Okay, something that you notice that I did not do with this sandpaper is I did not wrap it around my finger. A lot of times what students will think is the right way to sand on the lathe is to wrap this around your finger so that it will go with the contour of your fingers as well. The only problem, God forbid any of this starts to catch and get bound, you're going to get pulled in. So one of the things on your safety test, make sure you do not wrap sandpaper around your fingers. I'm going to do just a little bit more. I'm seeing some gouges up here. Okay, it's looking pretty good, so I'm going to switch to a 150. So this is the 150 grit on here. I'm going to go ahead and just flip that over. And this is where you really start to polish things. It's going to start to look really smooth. Okay, and 150. So this is, or excuse me, 220. This is actual polishing. Ooh, buttery smooth. Okay, so the last thing that we need to do now is just actually part it off. So we're gonna get a different tool. Sometimes you can end up using this guy, but I'm gonna switch and we're gonna end up using this parting tool. So I'm gonna start way up over here and just start kind of working my way in. Now, in order to prevent myself from getting trapped, you're gonna notice that I'm gonna cut and then I'm going to shift over and cut. I'm trying to not get to the top of this part here, and then same over here. I'm going to start by parting over here and then keep going down below. That way my wood doesn't start to pinch my parting tool. So if I go from this spot and then shift over, I've got plenty of clearance just in case I wobble back and forth a little bit. that means is I need to get my banjo back in place. We're going to get our tool rest back in place. And we're going to start grooving. I'm going to go pretty slow to start, just to make sure that I got my anchor bevel cut going just right. You're starting to see that my tool is bending quite, or my honey dipper is bending quite a bit, which is good, but we need to make sure that we're going even on both sides. My tool rest is a little bit high, so I'm going to drop that down just a hair. Keep going. Much better. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. Move over to this other side and just start doing the same thing. I'm noticing I'm bending quite a bit, so I'm just going to anchor and bevel and cut with one hand, just kind of up against my hip. Back up. Bouncing a little bit too much there, so I'm going to actually move that back just a hair. It's starting to bend a little bit more, so more pressure is meaning that it's wanting to snap. So we're going to take this part really nice and slow, make sure that we're not tossing our honey dipper off into oblivion. Okay, getting super thin on that side, which is good. I'm going to move back over here, just kind of continue working. I'm being ambidextrous, so I'm going to switch hands a little bit. And that guy is about ready to come off. Now, this side is a little less imperative for me since I'm left-handed. So I'm going to really focus on this side and then cut this part off with the bandsaw. So this will be where I go to do my finishing part. There it goes. So, top end came off. I've still got the back end attached. This is pretty easy to just walk up to the bandsaw and just do a quick touch up to make sure that that gets cut off. And then you'll end up using a little bit of the machines to get this cut, or excuse me, get this sanded, but you'll want to finish sanding that using hand sandpaper. Don't forget that these machines have 50 grit sandpaper, so it will eat. Same on both sides, okay? The rest of this is polished and ready for turning in. However, instead of turning this in to us just yet, this is going to go into your locker because we have not talked about finish. For your intarsia projects, we're going to use kind of a tongue oil to really make all of your wood sparkle. Tongue oil for us is poisonous though. So if we're trying to use this for a honey dipper, we don't want to get poisoned by our own products. So we're going to hang on to this until we're ready to get this turned in and we start talking about finishes. So go ahead and cut that part off on the bandsaw, get things sanded, and we're done with the honey dipper. However, we're not done with our current situation. Current situation as is with all these chips all over the place, not a good sign. There's a couple things that you need to do for cleanup that we need to do every single day with just about 10 minutes left. It takes a little bit longer to make sure you get everything cleaned up in the lathe. So we want to make sure that we get everything put back how it needs to go and make sure that it's ready for the next class period. So I'm going to go ahead and put a lot of my tools away, make sure that I've got all of my stuff put away in my lockers if I need. And then we're going to go ahead and start by moving the tailstock back. So tailstock, just unlock, make sure it goes to the edge of the bed. Also, be careful because this will go all the way off if Mr. Paschal's strong enough. So make sure that you're not having this sail right off the end, okay? See how that works? So I want to make sure it's at the very end and then go ahead and lock that in place in case somebody bumps it. They don't accidentally send it home too. Banjo comes back like this. Tool rest just needs to come down and you can set those off to the side. And then this is the time where you would go grab a brush and grab a broom and start to take care of the dust. You don't need to actually dust this off anywhere except for onto the floor. So grab a brush, dust it onto the floor. Myself or Miss Doolittle will actually be grabbing compressed air and helping you kind of spray a lot of these pieces out every once in a while. Last thing, face shield goes right back on top. All of your tools need to go into their storage bins or their plastic buckets if that's where that's at. Double check to make sure that your speed dial is set to 0, your machine is still off, and everything is still there.